What does it mean to wait? Truly wait? When waiting is all that stands between you and the end of everything you know. What did people do when winter arrived? Not as a season, but as a siege. When the snow fell and simply refused to stop. When the nights grew longer and longer, until daylight itself seemed like a distant memory. And when survival became less about action and more about the quiet, aching patience of endurance. Tonight, we're stepping back into a time when winter on the American frontier wasn't measured in weeks, but in the slow, creeping dread of months that stretched beyond reason. We're entering the louse-ceiling cabins of settlers who watched their wood piles shrink, their food stores dwindle, and their hope thin like ice over dark water. These were ordinary people, unremarkable in every way except one. They learned to wait through the darkest nights that seemed as though they might never end. They didn't conquer winter. They outlasted it, breath by breath, day by silent day. Before we step back into that frozen stillness, into those endless nights by dying fires, I'd ask one small thing of you. If this quiet journey speaks to you, tap the like button below and subscribe to Epic Boring History. So these late-night passages through forgotten corners of the past can continue to find you. Drop a comment too. Tell me where in the world you're listening from. What hour has brought you here? Whether you're wrapped in the deep silence of midnight or just beginning your day in some distant dawn. Now perhaps dim the lights around you. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle, constant hum that drowns out the sharper edges of the present moment. Let's settle in together and drift back to a time when winter came and wouldn't leave. When people sat by their hearths and simply waited for the world to thaw. Imagine yourself in a cabin so remote that the nearest neighbor might as well live on another continent. The year is somewhere in the late 1700s, perhaps the early 1800s. The exact date hardly matters because time moves differently out here, especially in winter. You arrived in the warmer months when the forest seemed generous, when the land promised something better than what you left behind. The cabin you built, or the one you bought from someone who gave up, felt sturdy enough then, with its thick log walls and its roof of split shingles. But that was autumn. And autumn is a liar on the frontier. Now it's deep winter, the kind that arrives in November and forgets to leave until March or April, or whenever it finally decides you've suffered enough. The snow began falling weeks ago, maybe months. You've lost count. At first, you marked the days carefully, scratching lines into a wooden beam near the door. But somewhere along the way, the lines started blurring together. One snowy day looks exactly like the one before it, and the one that will come after. The sky is the same pale gray at dawn and dusk, and the forest outside your single, small window has become a wall of white in shadow. You wake each morning in the dark because the sun, when it finally bothers to appear, doesn't rise until well after you've stirred from your pile of blankets. The cold wakes you, actually. It seeps through the layers of wool and hide you've wrapped yourself in, creeping into your bones, despite the fire you banked carefully the night before. Your breath is visible, even inside the cabin. Small clouds that vanish as quickly as they form. The frost has crept up the interior walls again. Delicate fern-like patterns that would be beautiful if they didn't represent the losing battle you're fighting against the cold. You lie there for a moment, gathering the will to move, because movement means leaving the small pocket of warmth you've created beneath your blankets. Your joints are stiff, not from injury or age necessarily, but from the persistent chill that never fully releases its grip on your body. When you finally rise, your feet touch the floor, and the cold strikes through your wool socks like a physical blow. You move quickly to the hearth, where a few coals still glow faintly beneath the ash. Adding kindling is a practiced ritual now, one you could do in your sleep. And sometimes you wonder, if you are asleep, if this whole winter is just one long dream you'll eventually wake from. The kindling catches, small flames licking upward, and you feed the fire carefully because you're always aware, always counting in the back of your mind how much wood remains in the dwindling pile outside. The cabin warms slightly, though warm is a generous word for what you feel. The fire pushes back the worst of the cold, creates a bubble of almost comfort that extends perhaps 6 feet out from the hearth. But the corners of the cabin remain frigid, and the air near the door is bitter. You've stuffed rags into every crack you can find, packed the spaces between logs with moss and mud. But the wind still finds its way inside, whispering through gaps you can't see. At night, you hear it, a soft, persistent whistle that reminds you the cabin is not truly sealed, that the wilderness is always just on the other side of these walls. Breakfast is simple because everything is simple now. You melt snow in a pot for water, watching the white compress down to almost nothing, requiring armfuls of snow to produce a single cup of liquid. The food is what it always is. Salt pork if you're lucky, cornmeal mush, dried beans soaked overnight in melted snow water. You've been eating variations of the same meal for so long that you barely taste it anymore. Eating is just something your body requires, like breathing or sleeping. You consume the food mechanically, thinking already about the next meal, about how many more meals the stores will provide, about whether you calculated correctly back in November when winter was just beginning. After breakfast, the day stretches before you like an unmarked path through deep snow, long, difficult, and leading nowhere in particular. There are tasks, of course, but they're the same tasks you performed yesterday and will perform tomorrow. You check the wood pile, counting again, knowing the number won't have magically increased, but checking anyway. You brush snow off the logs you'll need for tonight, tomorrow, the day after. You've already burned through the easiest wood, the pieces that were closest to the door, the ones that were driest and most convenient. Now you're working deeper into the pile, hauling heavier logs, brushing away more snow, your hands growing raw despite the mittens you wear. Inside again, you inspect the food stores, barrels of cornmeal, sacks of beans, dried meat hanging from the rafters, hard cheese wrapped in cloth. You know exactly what's there. You've looked at it 100 times, but you look again anyway because it gives you something to do. You calculate in your head how many weeks the supplies will last if you're careful, if you reduce portions, just a little more, if no accidents happen. The calculations bring no comfort. The answer is always probably enough, or maybe enough. Never definitely enough. The windows, those precious small openings that connect you to the outside world, require constant maintenance in winter. Frost forms on the inside of the glass, or oiled paper, thick enough that you can't see through it. You scrape it away with your fingernail, or wooden tool, creating a small, clear patch that will frost over again within hours. Through that temporary porthole, you watch a world that hasn't changed in weeks. Snow on the ground, snow on the trees, snow falling from gray skies, or clear, cold days where the sun glints off the white expanse with a brightness that hurts your eyes. There are no tracks, no movement, no signs of life, beyond the occasional branch breaking under the weight of accumulated ice. By midday, though midday is a guess, based on the faint lightening of the gray sky, you find yourself sitting near the fire with nothing productive to do. The cabin is as clean as it's going to get. Your tools are maintained. Your clothes are mended. You stare into the flames because they're the only moving thing in your world, watching patterns that form and dissolve, seeing shapes in the embers that mean nothing. Your mind wanders, and you let it, thinking about the past, about the decisions that led you here, about the people you left behind. Sometimes you talk to yourself just to hear a human voice, or you pray, if that's your custom. Quiet words spoken into the empty cabin. If you have family with you, a spouse, children, you've all grown quieter as winter has deepened. Conversations become practical, brief exchanges about tasks and needs. There's no energy for storytelling or laughter, not when everyone is focused on the same goal, making it through another day. The children, if there are children, have lost their restlessness. They sit quietly, too cold to play, too bored to imagine games, understanding, in their wordless way, that winter is serious, that this is not a time for noise or motion. Even between husband and wife, words become scarce. You can sit for hours in the same small space, tending the same fire, and speak only a handful of sentences. It's not anger or resentment. It's the fatigue of repetition, the sense that everything has already been said, that words won't change the snow or hurry the spring. The silence becomes its own language, a shared understanding that you're both enduring the same slow test. The afternoons blur into evenings, distinguished only by the dying of what little light filters through the frosted windows. Darkness comes early, always earlier than you expect, even though you've been through this every day for months. By 4, sometimes 3, the cabin is dim, and you light a candle if you have one to spare, or you simply sit in the firelight and wait for sleep. Nighttime is the hardest because there's nothing to mark its passing except the slow burning down of logs, the shifting of coals. You lie in your bed, if you can call it a bed, listening to the cabin settle around you. The logs creak as they contract in the cold, sharp cracks that sound like footsteps or breaking branches. The wind rises and falls, sometimes howling, sometimes dropping to nothing. And in the silence between gusts, you hear only your own breathing and the breathing of whoever shares this space with you. You sleep lightly, always half aware of the fire, knowing you might need to rise in the night, to add wood to make sure the flames don't die completely. A dead fire in winter is not just inconvenient. It's dangerous, a potential disaster that could mean hours of misery trying to rekindle it with numb fingers. So you wake, you check, you feed the fire, you return to bed, and you do this twice, 3 times a night, every night, week after week. And then morning comes again, indistinguishable from the morning before, and you begin the same small tasks in the same order. You're not living so much as maintaining, keeping the machinery of survival operating through sheer repetition. There are no goals beyond tonight, no plans beyond tomorrow. The future has compressed to the next meal, the next armful of wood, the next night survived. You find yourself thinking about warmth, the way a starving person thinks about food. You remember summer days when you complained about the heat, when sweat ran down your back and you sought shade. Those memories seem impossible now, like stories from someone else's life. You wonder if you'll ever be truly warm again, if spring will actually come, or if this winter might be the one that simply continues forever. The isolation does strange things to your sense of time. Days lose their individual character and merge into one long gray expanse. You forget what day of the week it is, forget what month it might be, forget how long you've been here in this frozen stillness. Sometimes you try to count back to remember when the first snow fell, but the numbers slip away from you. Your mind has adapted to this narrow existence, focused only on the immediate and practical, letting go of anything that doesn't serve survival. You notice yourself staring at nothing, losing minutes or hours to blank contemplation, your thoughts as empty as the white landscape beyond your walls. It's not unpleasant exactly, this mental quiet, but it's strange, unfamiliar, a state you never experienced in your old life, where there was always something happening, always someone nearby, always a reason to stay alert. Here, alertness is optional. There's nothing to be alert for except the fire and the cold. The physical toll is constant, but subtle. You're always slightly hungry because you're rationing. Always slightly cold because the fire can only do so much. Always slightly tired because you're not sleeping deeply. Your hands are rough and cracked. Your lips split despite whatever grease you rub on them. Your muscles stiff from inactivity, punctuated by brief bursts of labor. You're not sick, not injured, not in acute pain, but you're not well either. You exist in a gray zone between health and illness, between comfort and suffering, between living and merely surviving. Your body is doing what it must to endure, burning its reserves carefully, adapting to the reduced circumstances. You notice you're thinner than you were in autumn, your clothes looser, your face gauze, when you catch your reflection in the window glass. Everyone looks this way by late winter, lean, worn, older than their years. The waiting is the worst part. If there was something to do, some problem to solve, some enemy to fight, it would be easier. But winter doesn't fight. It simply exists, indifferent to your discomfort, unconcerned with your impatience. You can't argue with snow or negotiate with cold. You can only wait for the season to turn, for the sun to strengthen, for the first thought to begin. And you don't know when that will be. It could be next week or next month, February or April, tomorrow or 40 days from now. The uncertainty is exhausting in its own way, a weight that sits on your chest, even as you sit motionless by the fire. You find yourself watching for signs, a change in the wind, a different quality to the light, a sound from the forest that might indicate movement, life, the first hints of seasonal shift. But the signs don't come, or you miss them, or they're false. And winter continues its patient grip on the land. You've heard stories of settlers who didn't make it through winters like this, who ran out of food or fuel, who succumbed to illness, or simply to the grinding fatigue of endless cold. You don't speak about these stories, but you think about them in the dark hours, wondering what separated those who survived from those who didn't. It wasn't courage, you suspect, or even preparation. It was luck, random chance, The arbitrary grace of one more day, one more week, one more log in the pile. Sometimes you step outside briefly, just to break the monotony of the cabin's four walls. The cold hits you like a wall, stealing your breath, making your eyes water instantly. You stand on the threshold for just a moment, looking out at the unbroken white, at the trees weighted with snow, at the smoke from your chimney, rising straight up in the still air. The silence outside is absolute, profound, a silence so deep it feels like pressure against your ears. There are no bird calls, no animal sounds, no human voices, just the occasional crack of ice or the soft whisper of snow sliding off a branch. You retreat quickly back inside, closing the door, leaning against it, grateful for even the marginal warmth of the cabin. That brief excursion into the frozen world reminds you why you stay inside, why you've learned to endure the boredom and stillness. Outside is beautiful in its way, pristine and untouched, but it's also hostile, a place that will kill you if you stay too long or venture too far. The evening comes again, and you prepare for another night. You bank the fire carefully. You lay out your blankets. You blow out the candle, if you've been using one, and you settle into the darkness. Your body knows this routine so well, now that you move through it without thinking. Muscle memory, guiding you through the same motions you've performed countless times. You close your eyes and will yourself towards sleep, knowing tomorrow will be the same as today, that the day after will be identical. This is your life now, a waiting game, played against an opponent that cannot be rushed or reasoned with. You've become intimate with patience, not by choice, but by necessity, learning to measure time in the smallest increments, because larger measurements are too discouraging. 1 hour at a time, one meal at a time, one night at a time. You don't think about when winter will end because thinking about it makes the waiting harder. You simply continue waking, tending the fire, eating, checking supplies, staring into flames, sleeping, waking again. The rhythm of survival becomes hypnotic, almost meditative, a trance state that makes the days passable, if not pleasant. You're not heroic. You're not even particularly strong. You're just persistent, too stubborn or too practical to give up, too committed to the people who depend on you or to your own sense of self-preservation to simply stop. And so you wait in your small cabin on the endless frontier while winter presses down on the world outside and time itself seems frozen in place. You wait because waiting is all there is, because spring will come eventually. It always has before. And because survival is not about defeating winter, but about outlasting it. Day after gray day, night after silent night, you sit by your fire and simply continue to exist. The snow falls or doesn't fall. The wind blows or lies still. The temperature drops or rises by small degrees. None of it changes the essential reality of your situation. You are here. Winter is here. And somewhere beyond the months of cold and dark, there is a world that remembers color and warmth and life. You hold on to that knowledge like a small flame cupped in frozen hands, protecting it from the wind, believing without proof that it will be enough to see you through. Let us turn now from the general to the particular, from the experience of many to the quiet story of one. Her name was Sarah Kemble Knight, though history remembers her mostly through fragments, journal entries, land records, a few letters that survived the passage of time. She was not famous in her lifetime, not remarkable in any way that would make storytellers gather around her memory. She was a teacher, a businesswoman of modest means, a widow who managed properties and tried to build something stable in an unstable world. In the winter of 1704, she found herself in a situation that would become familiar to countless frontier settlers in the decades that followed. Stranded by weather, in a place far from home, waiting for conditions to improve enough to continue her journey. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's begin where she began, in the autumn that preceded that frozen stillness. Sarah had been born in Boston, a city by colonial standards, a place where buildings clustered together and neighbors lived close enough to call upon. She grew up knowing the rhythm of urban life, the bells marking time, the movement of people through streets, the constant hum of commerce and conversation. The Boston of her youth was a place of constant activity, where ships arrived bringing news from England and goods from distant ports, where the harbor smelled of salt and tar and fish. The streets were narrow and crooked, following paths that had been worn into existence rather than planned. And in winter, they turned to muddy tracks that froze solid overnight. She married young, bore children, taught reading and writing to supplement her husband's income. When her husband died, she did what widows of her time learned to do. She adapted, found ways to survive, took on responsibilities that would have been unusual for a woman, but were accepted out of necessity. The transition to widowhood had not been easy, though she never recorded complaints about it in the fragments of writing that survived. She had learned quickly that sympathy from neighbors lasted only so long, and that practical competence was worth more than tears. She managed small properties, witnessed legal documents, kept a school. Her life was not extraordinary, but it was hers, and she had carved out a place in the world through persistence and practical intelligence. Her school occupied a room in her home where she taught children of merchants and tradesmen their letters and figures. The work was steady, if not lucrative, and it gave her days, structure, and purpose at a time when both were necessary for sanity. In October of that year, word reached her that a relative had died in New Haven, leaving matters of inheritance and property that required attention. These things could not be handled by letter alone. Someone had to go in person to speak with lawyers, to sign documents, to ensure everything was properly settled. The relative had been a cousin, a man she'd known slightly in childhood, but had seen rarely in adulthood, the kind of family connection that existed more in name than in practice. Yet blood ties meant something in colonial society, meant obligation and opportunity in equal measure. And when property was involved, someone from the family needed to appear. Sarah, practical as always, decided she would make the journey herself. It was not uncommon for women to travel in the colonies, though it was also not entirely safe or comfortable. She had traveled before, short distances, mostly visiting neighboring towns on business or to see family. But this journey would be different, longer, more uncertain, requiring days away from everything familiar. The distance from Boston to New Haven was perhaps 150 namerg, a journey that in good conditions might take a week or two, depending on the roads and the weather. In October, with winter still months away, it seemed reasonable enough. Others might have waited until spring, might have sent a male relative, or hired a lawyer to act in proxy. But Sarah had learned not to trust others with matters she could handle herself. Had learned that competence was its own form of security in an uncertain world. She made preparations carefully, arranging for her school to be managed in her absence, settling her own affairs, gathering the funds she would need. She would travel with guides part of the way, staying at taverns and private homes along the route, following paths that were well known, if not well maintained. The preparations took nearly a week, finding someone reliable to oversee her students, ensuring her small properties would continue to generate income in her absence, packing appropriate clothing and supplies. She purchased a sturdy pair of leather gloves and had her riding boots repaired, small investments that seemed sensible for a journey of this length. The first part of the journey went as expected. Long days on horseback, roads that were rough but passable, accommodations that ranged from adequate to uncomfortable. She kept a journal noting the landscape she passed through, the people she met, the conditions of the roads and lodgings. Her writing was detailed and often wryly observant, recording the peculiarities of rural innkeepers and the challenges of finding suitable places to sleep. One tavern keeper, she noted, kept the establishment so dirty that she preferred to sleep sitting up in a chair rather than lie in the bed. Another served food so poor she wondered whether poverty or meanness was to blame. The countryside between Boston and New Haven was a mixture of settled farms and untouched wilderness, civilization thinning as she traveled south and west. She passed through towns that were barely more than a cluster of houses around a meeting hall and stretches of forest, where the road was just a track through trees marked by blazes cut into bark. She reached New Haven, conducted her business, and began the return journey in late November. The legal matters had taken longer than expected. Colonial bureaucracy moved slowly. Documents had to be copied by hand, witnesses found and assembled. Everything done with careful attention to form and precedent. She had stayed in New Haven nearly 3 weeks, lodging with a family who ran a boarding house near the Green. The time had not been wasted. She had learned about property values in Connecticut, had made connections that might prove useful for future business, had seen how other colonial towns organized themselves. This was where timing betrayed her. November in New England is unpredictable. Some years, it's merely cool and rainy. Other years, winter arrives early and with force. The signs had been there, visible to anyone who knew how to read them. Flocks of birds flying south in unusually large numbers, squirrels gathering nuts with particular urgency, the way the light changed in the afternoons. But Sarah had business to conclude, a schedule to keep, reasons to believe she could outrun the weather. That year, winter came early. The first snow fell before the end of the month. Light at first, then heavier, accumulating faster than it melted. She had been on the road 2 days when the first flakes began to fall, scattered and seemingly harmless. By evening they were falling steadily, and by the next morning the world had transformed into something white and hostile. The roads, already poor in the best conditions, became nearly impossible. Sarah found herself traveling shorter distances each day, struggling through snow that made every mile difficult. Her horse, a reliable mare she had hired in New Haven, moved cautiously through the deepening snow, each step requiring effort. The guides who had accompanied her the first part of the journey were no longer with her. They had turned back at a predetermined point, and she was traveling with local guides who knew these particular roads, men who grew quieter and more concerned as the snow continued. The cold was not yet bitter, but it was persistent, the kind of cold that found its way through clothing and settled into bones. Her hands grew numb despite her gloves, her feet lost feeling in the stirrups, and her face felt raw from the constant exposure to wind and snow. By early December, she was forced to stop at a settlement, barely more than a collection of cabins, really, and wait for conditions to improve. The place was called Dedham, a small frontier community west of Boston, close enough to the city that she could imagine being home. Far enough that the distance seemed insurmountable in the snow. Dedham was not a planned town, but an accumulation of necessity. A few families who had claimed land and built homes close enough for mutual protection, but far enough apart for adequate farming. There was no church yet, no proper tavern, just houses scattered along what would someday be a proper road, but was now barely a path. She took lodging with a family, paying for a corner of their cabin, a share of their fire, and their food. She had planned to be home by now, had expected to be back at her school, her own hearth, her own bed. The family consisted of a husband and wife, both younger than Sarah, and 3 children, ranging from perhaps 8 years to an infant. They had accepted her money and her presence with neither enthusiasm nor complaint. It was simply what one did, take in travelers stranded by circumstance, though the extra mouth to feed was clearly a burden. Instead, she found herself living in the daily reality we've already explored. The waiting, the cold, the slow passage of days that all look the same. Her journal entries from this period grow shorter, less detailed, more focused on simple facts: the weather, the food, the small events of cabin life. The cabin itself was a single room with a loft where the children slept, built of logs chinkicked with mud and moss. There was one window covered with oiled paper that let in diffused light but no clear view, one door that had to be kept closed against the cold, and one fireplace that was the center of all life. She writes about waking to find frost on the inside walls, about the difficulty of keeping ink from freezing, about the monotony of meals. There is no drama in these entries, no complaints exactly, just a flat recording of conditions, a catalog of discomfort without embellishment. The frost formed intricate patterns on the interior walls, beautiful in its way, but a constant reminder of how thin the barrier was between shelter and wilderness. Her ink, which she kept in a small bottle, wrapped in cloth and tucked against her body for warmth, still sometimes froze overnight, rendering it useless until she could thaw it by the fire. Meals were variations on a theme: cornmeal mush in the morning, sometimes with a bit of salt pork if they were fortunate. At midday, perhaps dried beans that had been soaking since the night before. In the evening, more cornmeal, sometimes baked into a hard bread. There was no fresh meat, no vegetables except some withered roots stored in a hole beneath the floor. No variety to break the monotony. She mentions the other people in the cabin rarely, and when she does, it's in passing. They're quiet, she notes, conserving their energy, moving through their tasks with minimal conversation. She, too, has become quiet, recognizing that talk requires energy better saved for endurance. The husband spent his days attending to necessary tasks, bringing in wood from the diminishing pile outside, checking on the small barn where 2 cows and a pig lived, making minor repairs to tools and household items. He was a man of perhaps 30, weathered beyond his years, with hands scarred from labor, and a face that rarely showed expression. The wife moved through her domestic routines with an efficiency born of long practice, tending the fire, preparing meals, managing the children, mending clothes that were already more patched than original fabric. She was thin in a way that suggested chronic insufficiency rather than illness, her face sharp-featured and watchful. The days developed their own rhythm, one she had no choice but to adopt. She rose when the others rose, helped with small tasks when she could, spent long hours sitting near the fire with nothing to do. Rising meant leaving the relative warmth of her corner, where she slept on a pallet of straw covered with her own blankets and her traveling cloak. The cold of morning was always a shock, a physical assault that required deliberate will to move through. She tried to keep up her writing, but found that she had less and less to say. The world had contracted to the size of a single room, and that room offered little variation from one day to the next. Her journal, which had been full of observations during her journey, now contained entries like December 8th, snow continues, cold cornmeal for breakfast. The sparseness was not a choice, but a reflection of reality. There was simply nothing more to report. She writes about the quality of the light, how gray it was, how it seemed to drain color from everything. She writes about the sounds, the wind, the fire, the creak of wood contracting in the cold. The light was particularly oppressive, a uniform grayness that made it difficult to tell morning from afternoon. On days when the sun appeared at all, it was a pale disk visible through the clouds, offering illumination without warmth, presence without comfort. The sounds became a constant backdrop to consciousness. The wind that never seemed to stop, sometimes howling, sometimes merely moaning, always present. The fire crackling and popping, occasionally spitting embers onto the hearth. The wood of the cabin contracting in the cold, with sharp cracks that sounded like gunshots, startling her, even after weeks of hearing them. She writes about time itself becoming strange, days blurring together, until she had to count back carefully to remember what date it might be. There's a passage in her journal, written in late December, where she admits she's not certain whether Christmas has passed or is still to come. The family made no mention of Christmas when it arrived, observed no particular ritual that marked it as different from any other day. Sarah found herself uncertain whether this was because they didn't know the date either, or because the celebration of Christmas was not part of their particular religious practice, or simply because survival left no energy for observance. The admission is matter-of-fact, not distressed, just a recognition that she's lost track, that the markers of time have become meaningless in this white expanse. She writes about thinking of home, constantly picturing her room, her possessions, her students. Home existed in her mind as a series of specific images: her own bed with its heavy quilts, the chair by her window where she liked to read in the afternoon, the shelf where she kept her books. She thought about her students, wondered who was teaching them, whether they were learning anything or simply marking time until her return. These thoughts brought no comfort, she notes. They only made the waiting harder, made the contrast between where she was and where she wanted to be more stark. Eventually, she tried to think less about home, to accept her current situation without constantly measuring it against what she'd lost. This mental discipline was harder than any physical hardship. This conscious decision to stop hoping to stop comparing, to simply exist in the present moment without yearning. She found that, on the days she succeeded, the waiting was more bearable. On the days she failed, the cabin felt like a prison, and the snow like bars. She had responsibilities waiting for her in Boston. Her school needed her. Her properties required management. Her children and grandchildren expected her return, but there was nothing she could do to hasten that return. The snow had made the decision for her. Her eldest daughter had 3 children of her own, and Sarah had promised to help with the youngest during the winter months. That promise now hung unfulfilled. Another source of guilt and worry that she tried unsuccessfully to push from her mind. She writes about the guilt of inaction, the feeling that she should be doing something productive, managing something, teaching someone. But there was no one to teach here, nothing to manage except her own patience. The children in the cabin were too young or too old for her particular skills. The oldest could already read, after a fashion taught by his mother. The youngest was still an infant. The middle child showed no interest in letters. She offered once to teach them, but the offer was declined with quiet courtesy, the mother suggesting that learning could wait for better times. The hardest part, she admits in one entry, was not knowing when it would end. If someone had told her it would be 6 weeks, or 8 or 10, she could have prepared herself mentally, could have marked off the days on some internal calendar. This uncertainty was perhaps the cruelest aspect of winter. Not its cold or its monotony, but its indefinite duration. Spring would come eventually. Everyone knew that. But eventually could mean a month, or 3 months. And there was no way to know which it would be. But no one knew winter would last as long as it lasted, would release its grip when it was ready, and not before. This uncertainty was its own form of suffering, a constant low-level anxiety that accompanied every morning's assessment of the weather. She developed a habit of waking before dawn, lying still in the darkness, and listening, trying to determine from the quality of the wind and the sounds outside where the conditions had changed. Most mornings brought disappointment. The wind still howled, the cold still penetrated. Nothing had improved. January arrived, or she assumed it did based on her best calculations, and the cold deepened. The family she lodged with grew quieter still. Conversations reduced to essential exchanges about fuel and food. The cold of January was different from the cold of December, deeper and more vicious, the kind of cold that made every breath hurt, and every movement and exercise in willpower. The fire, which had seemed adequate before, now felt inadequate, its warmth extending only a few feet before being swallowed by the surrounding cold. Sarah noticed the way the mother counted out portions at meals. The careful rationing that meant supplies were running lower than comfortable. She offered what coins she had to contribute to the household expenses, but coins couldn't buy what wasn't available. There was no store to visit, no market to purchase supplies. The mother accepted the coins with a nod, but without comment, tucking them somewhere in her clothing. Both women understood the gesture was more symbolic than practical. Money meant nothing when there was nothing to buy. What they had was all they would have until spring allowed for travel and trade. She writes about feeling like a burden, another mouth to feed when food was already scarce. The guilt of this pressed on her constantly. Though she knew her payment had been generous, and her presence was not truly unwelcome. Still, she saw the way the portions grew smaller as January progressed. The way the father spent more time outside in impossible cold, checking traps that yielded nothing, hoping for game that had long since fled or hidden. She tried to make herself useful, helping where she could, but her skills, reading, writing, legal documentation, had no application here. She was a woman accustomed to purpose and productivity, now reduced to passive waiting. She could tend the fire, stir the pot, help hang wet clothing near the hearth to dry. These were small tasks that anyone could do, that required no particular skill, and they did nothing to alleviate her sense of uselessness. The days took on a dream-like quality. She writes about sitting by the fire for hours, staring at the flames, her mind drifting through memories and half-thoughts that led nowhere. The flames became hypnotic, their movement the only dynamic element in a world that had gone static. She found herself following individual flames from birth to death, watching them leap and dance and eventually gutter out, replaced by others in an endless cycle. She describes the sensation of time slowing down, of minutes stretching into hours, of the space between sunrise and sunset, feeling impossibly long despite the shortness of the actual daylight. She began to understand, she writes, why frontier people were different from city people. It wasn't just the hardship of physical labor. It was the psychological adaptation required to endure this kind of stillness. In the city, there was always movement, always something happening, always a reason to stay engaged with the world. Here, engagement was pointless. The world was frozen, unchanging, indifferent to observation. The frontier demanded a different kind of person, she realized, not necessarily stronger or braver, but more patient, more able to exist without stimulation or purpose. It demanded people who could be still without going mad, who could wait without counting the cost of waiting. She found herself praying more, not from increased devotion necessarily, but because prayer was something to do, words to speak into the silence. She recited passages she'd memorized from Scripture, finding comfort not in their meaning so much as in their familiarity, their connection to a larger framework of time and meaning. The Psalms were particularly useful with their rhythms and repetitions, their expressions of suffering and endurance. She found herself returning again and again to the same verses, not because they spoke to her particular situation, but because their cadences were soothing, their language a refuge from the barren present. She counted days, or tried to, scratching marks on a piece of bark with a bit of charcoal. But she lost track more than once, had to start over, eventually gave up entirely on precise tracking, and settled for a vague sense of early winter, becoming deep winter, becoming eventually late winter. The piece of bark marked with her attempted calendar became a monument to futility. She kept it anyway, perhaps as a reminder of the human need to measure and mark time, even when time had become meaningless. There were moments of acute discomfort, days when the cold seemed to penetrate deeper than usual, when her hands refused to warm, even pressed against her body, when sleep came fitfully and left her more tired than before. There were also moments of something approaching acceptance, when the stillness felt almost peaceful, when she stopped fighting mentally against her situation and simply existed within it. On the worst days, she felt as though the cold was inside her, a presence in her chest and her bones that no amount of external warmth could touch. Her fingers developed chilblains, painful swelling and redness that made even simple tasks difficult. She writes about a day in what she thought was February when she sat and watched snow fall for hours, mesmerized by the endless descent of flakes. There was something hypnotic about it, she notes, something that emptied her mind of worry and left only observation. The snow fell in perfect silence, each flake following its own unpredictable path downward, and she found herself trying to follow individual flakes, losing them, finding others. It was meaningless activity, but it occupied her mind completely, leaving no room for anxiety or planning or regret. She describes feeling for that brief time almost content, not happy, but at peace with her circumstances in a way she hadn't been since arriving. The feeling passed, of course, replaced by the usual low-grade anxiety and restlessness. But she remembered it, returned to it in her thoughts when the waiting became particularly difficult. That moment of snow watching became something like a talisman for her, proof that peace was possible even in these circumstances. When the waiting seemed unbearable, she would recall it, try to recreate that state of empty observation. The journal entries from late winter grow even shorter, a sentence or two per day, sometimes nothing at all, for several days in a row. This wasn't because nothing happened. It was because nothing happened. The blank pages in her journal, gaps of 3 or 4 or 5 days, spoke more eloquently than any description could of the emptiness of those days. There was literally nothing to record. No event worth noting, no thought worth preserving. There was no variation to record, no events worth noting. She was simply there day after day, waiting. The waiting had become her entire existence. Not something she was doing, but something she was. She was a woman waiting, and that was the complete and total truth of her life in those weeks. The thaw, when it finally began, was subtle. Not a dramatic break, but a gradual softening. The air shifted slightly, warming by degrees too small to measure, but enough to feel. The first sign was a change in the quality of the cold. It lost its sharp edge, became less aggressive, less penetrating. Sarah noticed it before anyone mentioned it. Noticed the way her breath no longer hung in the air quite as visibly. The way the frost on the walls took longer to form at night. The snow on the roof began to drip during the day, refreezing at night, but dripping again the next morning. These small signs were watched eagerly by everyone in the cabin, hope kindling cautiously after months of suppression. The sound of dripping water was like music after the long silence of winter. Each drop, a promise that the frozen world was not permanent. The father went outside more frequently, checking conditions, assessing the snow depth, calculating when travel might become possible. Sarah writes about noticing a bird one morning, the first she'd seen or heard in months. She doesn't identify what kind of bird it was. That detail didn't matter. The bird's song heard through the cabin walls was impossibly loud and impossibly cheerful. It seemed absurd that something so small could make such sound, could pierce through winter's silence with such insistence. What mattered was that something living had moved through the landscape, that the natural world was beginning to wake. The roads remained impossible for a while longer, mud and slush replacing snow, creating different obstacles, but obstacles nonetheless. The mud was in some ways worse than snow, a thick glutinous mass that would suck the shoes from a person's feet, trap a horse's hooves, make every step a struggle. but it was mud from melting, and melting meant spring, and spring meant possibility. But the psychological weight had lifted slightly. The waiting had an end point now, visible, if not yet reached. In early March, by her best estimate, Sarah was finally able to resume her journey. The decision to leave was not dramatic. One morning, the father simply announced that the roads were passable enough for careful travel, and Sarah, who had thought she would feel triumphant at this moment, instead felt only quiet relief and a strange reluctance to leave the place that had held her captive. The roads were poor, the travel slow and uncomfortable, but she was moving again, making progress, closing the distance between her current location and home. She writes about the relief of motion, of purpose restored, of leaving behind that cabin where she'd spent so many empty hours. The journey took 3 more days. Hard days of riding through mud and slush, of stopping frequently to rest the horse, of arriving each evening exhausted at whatever accommodation could be found. But they were days of progress, each mile bringing her closer to home, and that made them bearable. She also writes briefly about the family who'd hosted her, their quiet resilience, their ability to endure without complaint, their simple continuation through circumstances that offered no reward beyond survival. She doesn't romanticize them or claim to fully understand their lives. In parting, the mother had given her a small bundle of dried herbs, a gesture whose significance Sarah didn't entirely understand, but accepted gratefully. The father had helped her mount her horse and wished her safe travels, his face showing neither relief at her departure nor regret, just the same neutral expression he'd worn throughout her stay. She simply notes that they'd survived another winter, would plant again in spring, would do it all again the following year. She reached Boston in mid-March, returned to her school, to her properties, to the life she'd built. Boston, when she reached it, seemed almost unbearably loud and crowded after months of silence. The streets were full of people and noise and movement, and she found herself overwhelmed by it all, retreating to her room for a full day before she could face the demands of resuming her normal life. The winter became a story she could tell, an adventure of sorts, though in the telling it probably gained drama it hadn't possessed in the living. But in her private journal, the record remained, those flat, spare entries documenting days of waiting. She told the story selectively, finding that people wanted either heroic adventure or comic misfortune. And her experience fit neither category. So she learned to shape it for her audience, adding amusing details about the inns on her journey, glossing over the empty weeks in Dedham. She never traveled in winter again, if she could help it. Never again, and put herself in a position where she might be stranded by weather. The experience had taught her something about the frontier, about the people who lived there, about the difference between enduring hardship as a temporary visitor and living it as a permanent condition. This was perhaps the most important lesson she carried away, that there was a profound difference between choosing hardship and having no choice, between knowing an ordeal would end and having no such certainty. The frontier demanded different terms of existence than she was willing to accept permanently. She'd been lucky, really. She'd had funds to pay for lodging. She'd been healthy enough to endure the cold. She'd been waiting with a specific goal in mind and a home to return to. For the people who lived permanently on the frontier, there was no home to return to. The cabin she'd visited was their home. The family in Dam would face another winter, and another after that, would watch their children grow up knowing nothing but this cycle of survival. They would endure it without complaint because complaint was pointless, would persist because persistence was all they had. Their waiting didn't end in March with her departure. It simply paused until the next winter arrived. Sarah lived another 23 years after that frozen winter, dying in 1727 at the age of 61. Those years were productive ones. She continued teaching, expanded her business interests, saw her grandchildren grow and marry. But she never forgot that winter, never lost the knowledge it had given her about herself and about the world beyond Boston's streets. She continued teaching, continued managing properties, continued being practical and productive. Her journal from that winter journey was eventually published much later and became a minor historical document, one of the few detailed accounts by a woman of colonial travel. The journal's publication came nearly 40 years after her death, when such documents were being collected by historians interested in preserving colonial records. It was edited, of course, parts omitted, that the editors found tedious or inappropriate, but enough remained to give readers a sense of her voice and her experience. Historians have studied it for what it reveals about roads and taverns and early American life. But the part that perhaps reveals the most is the part that says the least. Those brief, spare entries from deep winter when she had nothing to report except the weather and the waiting. Modern readers sometimes find these entries frustrating, wishing she had written more, had reflected more deeply, had given them the emotional insight they seek. But the sparseness itself is the insight. This is what it felt like to have nothing happen, to exist in a state where reflection offered no comfort and detailed observation found nothing to observe. Those entries show us something that dramatic narratives often miss: the simple, undramatic endurance that characterized so much of frontier life. Sarah wasn't a hero, wasn't a pioneer in the romantic sense. The mythology of the frontier developed in later centuries would emphasize adventure and conquest, individual courage and dramatic triumph. But the daily reality for most frontier dwellers was neither adventurous nor triumphant. It was simply difficult, requiring not heroism, but persistence. She was just a practical woman who found herself stuck in an uncomfortable situation and waited it out because there was no other choice. Her winter was survived not through courage or strength, but through patience, through the willingness to simply continue existing, even when existence offered nothing interesting or pleasant. This was the reality that historical narratives often obscured, that most of history was made by people who were simply getting through their days, who endured because the alternative was unthinkable, who survived not through any particular virtue, but through sheer stubborn continuation. And when spring finally came and she could leave, she did so quietly, without fanfare, carrying with her the knowledge that winter on the frontier was not an adventure, but an ordeal, one that countless others were living through at that very moment, and would live through again the following year and the year after that. The snow fell, the cold settled in, the days blurred together, and people waited. That was the story. Not exciting, not dramatic, but true in a way that drama never quite captures. Sarah wrote it down as faithfully as she could, and then she went home. Her journal survived because she kept it, Because someone after her death thought it worth preserving, because the accidents of history allowed it to endure. Most stories like hers were never recorded, were lived and forgotten, leaving no trace beyond perhaps a notation in a parish record or a line in a land deed. And life continued, as it always does, until the next winter came. Now let us drift into something more elusive, something that exists in the spaces between recorded events and documented lives. We've walked through the daily experience of frontier winter. We've followed one woman's quiet endurance through a season that refused to end. And now we turn to something harder to grasp. The culture that emerged from all that waiting, the ways of thinking and being that developed when stillness became the dominant condition of existence. This is territory where facts grow scarce and interpretation must fill the gaps. The people who lived through these winters left few records of their inner lives, their thoughts during those long hours by the fire, their strategies for maintaining sanity in the face of unrelenting sameness. But we can look at what remains, the structures they built, the objects they left behind, the occasional journal entry or letter that hints at something deeper. We can ask questions that may have no definitive answers. But in the asking, we might come closer to understanding what it meant to live in a time when winter was not a season to be endured briefly, but a way of life to be accommodated. Consider first the cabins themselves, those small wooden structures that dot the archaeological record of frontier settlements. When we excavate their foundations, when we measure their dimensions and analyze their construction, certain patterns emerge that speak to the priorities of their builders. The cabins were small, often just a single room, perhaps 16 faas by 20, sometimes even less. This wasn't merely a matter of limited resources or construction time. It was a deliberate choice born of necessity. A small space was easier to heat, required less fuel, concentrated warmth in a way that larger structures could not. The ceiling height was low, sometimes barely 6 feet, forcing even average height adults to move carefully to duck beneath the rafters. Again, this was intentional. Heat rises and a low ceiling trapped that precious warmth closer to the occupants. These cabins were not designed for comfort in any modern sense. They were designed for thermal efficiency, for survival. The windows, when they existed at all, were tiny, small squares of oiled paper or glass, positioned not for light or view, but to minimize heat loss. Many cabins had only one window, or none at all, accepting darkness as the price of warmth. The door was thick, often hung with care, to fit tightly in its frame. And many cabins had a second interior door, or a heavy curtain, creating an airlock of sorts, a buffer zone between the outside cold and the inside warmth. Archaeological evidence shows that gaps between logs were carefully chinked with moss, mud, cloth, anything that would seal against the wind. This wasn't done once and forgotten. It was maintenance that required constant attention as materials dried, cracked, and fell away. The chinking itself tells a story of vigilance, of inhabitants who understood that survival depended on attention to small details, on noticing when cold air began to seep through a newly opened crack. The hearth was always positioned against one wall, often the north wall, and built large enough to dominate the room. The stones used in hearth construction were chosen with care, rocks that wouldn't crack or explode when heated, positioned to radiate warmth long after the flames had died down. The fire was the heart of the cabin in more than metaphorical terms. It was the source of heat, light, and the ability to prepare food. Everything else in the cabin's design radiated outward from that central need. Sleeping areas clustered near the hearth, often built as simple platforms raised slightly off the floor where cold air settled. Storage was arranged to maximize space without blocking warmth. And the daily life of the inhabitants revolved around maintaining the fire and staying within its sphere of influence. The wood supply was typically stacked just outside the door, close enough to be reached without venturing far into the cold, arranged so that snow wouldn't completely bury it. Inside, a smaller stack of kindling and dry wood was kept near the hearth, ensuring that the fire could always be quickly rekindled if it threatened to go out during the night. When we find these cabin sites today, we find them aligned with the landscape in specific ways, positioned to break the wind, nestled against rises or tree lines that provided natural shelter, oriented to catch whatever winter sun might be available. The builders were thinking not of views or aesthetics, but of protection from elements that could kill. Some cabins were built partially into hillsides, using the earth itself as insulation against the wind. Others were positioned in small valleys or clearings where surrounding trees formed natural windbreaks, though not so close that falling branches posed a danger. What strikes the modern observer looking at reconstructions or reading descriptions is how dark these spaces must have been. Even with a fire burning brightly, even with whatever candles or lamps the inhabitants could afford, the interior would have been dim. Shadows pressing in from the corners, faces visible only in the flickering firelight. The world beyond the cabin completely invisible once darkness fell. This darkness was not just physical, but psychological, for people accustomed to the natural rhythms of daylight and darkness. The extended darkness of winter cabin life must have had profound effects. The human eye adjusts to firelight, learns to see in dimness. But this adjustment comes with its own peculiarities. Distances become harder to judge. Peripheral vision diminishes, and the world shrinks to what the fire illuminates. Beyond the circle of firelight, the cabin became a space of shadows and uncertain shapes. Familiar objects rendered strange and slightly threatening by inadequate light. Without clocks, and many frontier settlers had no timepieces, the passage of time became abstract. How do you mark the hours when you can't see the sun, when each day is an identical sequence of feeding the fire, eating, sitting, sleeping? Some families made marks on walls or beams, scratching lines to track days. But many gave up this practice as winter deepened. What was the point of counting when the count only reminded you how many days had passed without change? The act of marking time became, for some, more painful than helpful. Each new mark was evidence that another day had been endured, but nothing had changed. That tomorrow would be the same as today. That the winter showed no signs of releasing its grip. Some families marked only Sundays, trying to maintain at least the weekly rhythm, if not the daily one. But even this could lapse when the distinction between one day and the next became meaningless. Time became measured in more immediate terms. The interval between meals, the burning down of a log, the cycles of waking and sleeping. The concept of today and tomorrow remained, but the distinction between last Tuesday and this Tuesday dissolved into irrelevance. Morning meant waking and rekindling the fire. Afternoon meant the dimming of whatever light came through the small window. Evening meant preparing for the long darkness ahead, making sure enough wood was stacked within reach. Some settlers interviewed, or writing letters, after the fact, described losing entire weeks to a kind of temporal fog, realizing only in retrospect that significant calendar dates, Christmas, New Year, birthdays, had passed without acknowledgement. This wasn't mere forgetfulness. It was an adaptation to an environment where calendar time had become meaningless. One woman wrote years later about realizing in late February that she'd missed Christmas entirely, had prepared no special meal, made no acknowledgement of the day, and only discovered her oversight when spring visitors asked about her holiday. She described feeling both embarrassed and oddly justified. What difference did it make, she reasoned, whether December 25th was marked or not, when every day was the same? What mattered was not the date, but the state of supplies, the depth of the snow, the temperature inside the cabin. Survival operated on its own calendar, one that had nothing to do with what month it might be, according to civilized reckoning. The important dates were practical ones. The day the last of the dried apples were eaten. The day the flour barrel was half empty. The day someone noticed the first signs of scurvy in bleeding gums or loosening teeth. These were the milestones that mattered. The markers by which winter was measured not in weeks, but in declining resources and increasing desperation. Food during these extended winters became both simpler and more psychologically significant than it had been in other seasons. The archaeological record shows a storage pits near cabins, cold cellars dug below the frost line, barrels that once held cornmeal or flour, hooks in rafters where meat was hung. The planning required for winter survival was extensive. Crops had to be harvested and preserved. Game had to be hunted and smoked or salted. Every possible calorie had to be gathered and stored before the snow began. Families calculated carefully, trying to estimate how much food they would need to last until spring. But these calculations were often based on hope rather than certainty, because no one knew how long winter would actually last. The contents of these stores grew more monotonous as winter progressed. Early winter might offer some variety. Dried venison, salt pork, dried apples, beans, cornmeal, perhaps some root vegetables stored in the cellar. But as the weeks turned to months, the variety narrowed. Meat, if it lasted at all, became so salt the eye that it required long soaking before it was edible. And even then, it remained tough and unpleasant, more a source of necessary protein than anything resembling enjoyment. Cornmeal became the staple of nearly every meal. Mush for breakfast. Bread, if there was. Fat to make it palatable. More mush for dinner. The preparation of cornmeal mush was simple enough that it could be done with minimal attention. Water boiled, cornmeal stirred in. The mixture cooked until it thickened into something that could be eaten. Beans, if they hadn't run out, appeared again and again in the same preparation. There was no pleasure in eating, no anticipation of meals, just the mechanical consumption of calories necessary to maintain body heat and function. Some families tried to introduce variation by changing how they prepared the same ingredients. Cornmeal fried as cakes one day, boiled as mush the next, baked as bread when there was fat available. But these were small variations on the same theme, and the underlying monotony remained inescapable. Yet the preparation and consumption of food took on an importance beyond nutrition. Meals marked time, provided structure to the shapeless days, gave purpose to the hours spent near the fire. The ritual of preparing food, even food as simple as cornmeal mush, became a meditation, a practiced sequence of motions that connected the present to the remembered past. Hands moved through familiar patterns, measuring and stirring and serving. And in these motions, there was comfort, even when the food itself offered little. Every frontier settler carried food memories from before their winter isolation. The taste of fresh bread, the smell of meat roasting, the sweetness of preserved fruit. During the long winter evenings, these memories became a form of sustenance themselves, shared between family members in quiet conversations. Do you remember when we had became a common opening, leading to descriptions of meals that took on almost mythical qualities in the retelling? A simple dish of fresh greens became, in memory, a feast worthy of kings. The act of remembering meals past served multiple purposes. It reminded people that variety existed, that their current state was temporary, that better food would come again. It also bound families together through shared memory, creating connections between isolated individuals who might otherwise have retreated entirely into their own thoughts. The promise of such meals in the future, when spring finally came and gardens could be planted, when chickens would lay eggs again, when trade would resume, was part of what kept people moving forward. Food was survival, but it was also hope. Even when the present reality was endless cornmeal and salt pork. Planting the spring garden during the depths of winter became an act of faith, a declaration that winter would end, that there would be a spring, that life would continue beyond the present suffering. Families discussed what they would plant, where each crop would go, what they would eat first when fresh food became available again. And these discussions were as important as any prayer. Coping strategies for the psychological weight of winter isolation varied from family to family, but certain patterns emerge from the fragmentary, airy evidence we have. Storytelling was perhaps the most universal. Tales told by firelight, repeated so often that everyone knew them by heart, but listened anyway because the familiar was comforting. These stories ranged widely in content and character. Some were traditional folk tales brought from the old country passed down through generations. Others were personal histories, stories of how the family had come to this place, adventures from before the settling, tales of relatives as left behind in the East or across the ocean. Religious families recited scripture, said prayers together, observed what holy days they could remember. The rhythm of religious practice provided structure even when that practice had been stripped to its bare essentials. A prayer before sleeping, a blessing over meager meals, a Sabbath marked by refraining from unnecessary labor. For some, this religious framework was deeply meaningful, a genuine source of comfort and connection to something larger than their immediate suffering. For others, it was simply another way of marking time, a familiar routine that gave shape to days that otherwise had no shape at all. The reading of Scripture aloud, when books were available, served multiple purposes. It provided entertainment, structure, and moral guidance all at once. The same passages would be read repeatedly, not because new ones weren't available, but because the familiar words were more comforting than unfamiliar ones, and because in extreme circumstances, people craved predictability rather than novelty. Some settlers carved or whittled by the fire, producing simple wooden objects, spoons, bowls, toys for children, not because these things were needed, but because the activity kept hands busy and minds occupied. Women mended and remended clothing that had already been repaired multiple times, their fingers moving through familiar motions while their thoughts drifted elsewhere. The products of this winter work were often crude by necessity. Light was poor, materials were limited, and the goal was occupation rather than craftsmanship. Yet some beautiful objects emerged from these long winter evenings, pieces that showed care and attention despite the circumstances, evidence that even in the midst of survival, people felt the need to create something, to make something that hadn't existed before. Handwork of all kinds served a dual purpose. It produced useful items, however simple, and it gave restless minds and hands something to focus on besides the cold, the hunger, and the endless waiting. A woman darning socks for the 1,000th time wasn't just preserving clothing. She was maintaining her own sanity through repetitive, familiar motion. Children, when they were present, posed a particular challenge. Young children couldn't understand why they had to stay inside, why they couldn't play freely, why everything had become so restricted and quiet. The energy of children, normally an asset, became a liability in the closed confines of a winter cabin where resources were limited and warmth was precious. Active play generated appetite, and appetite meant consuming food that needed to last weeks or months longer. Parents did what they could to keep children occupied, teaching them letters if they knew letters themselves, telling stories, creating simple games that required no movement or noise. But mostly, children in winter cabins learned to be still, to sit quietly for hours to mirror the patient waiting of their parents. This enforced stillness must have been difficult for energetic children. Yet the alternative, children burning precious energy in play, requiring more food, potentially becoming sick from cold exposure, was worse. So children grew quiet, learned to entertain themselves with small things, and in that quietness, perhaps learned something about endurance that served them later in their own frontier lives. Some children developed elaborate imaginary worlds, retreating into fantasy as a way of coping with the restricted reality of winter cabin life. Others became intensely focused on small objects, a carved toy, a pretty stone, a scrap of fabric, investing these items with significance far beyond their actual worth, simply because there was nothing else to focus on. The silence itself became a defining characteristic of winter cabin life. In settlements, in towns, in cities, there was always ambient noise, people moving, talking, working, living. On the isolated frontier, especially in deep winter, silence was profound and omnipresent. The only sounds were those made by the inhabitants themselves, or by the cabins settling around them. The pop and crackle of fire, the creak of contracting wood, the howl of wind outside. This silence was both peaceful and oppressive, depending on temperament and circumstance. Some found it calming, a relief from the noise and demands of ordinary life, an opportunity to hear their own thoughts clearly for perhaps the first time in their lives. Others found it maddening, a constant reminder of isolation, a void that pressed on the mind and demanded to be filled with thoughts that might better have remained unexplored. In the absence of external stimulation, people turned inward, and what they found there was not always comfortable. The silence amplified small sounds, a cough, a sigh, the rustle of someone shifting position. These sounds, which would have gone unnoticed in normal life, became intrusive in the profound quiet, reminding everyone constantly of the other bodies sharing the small space, the lack of privacy, the impossibility of solitude, even while being profoundly isolated from the wider world. Doubts that had been held at bay by activity and purpose surfaced during the long, idle hours. Questions about choices made, why they'd come to this place, whether they'd made a terrible mistake, whether they had the strength to continue, emerged from the silence and could not be easily dismissed. These questions were dangerous because they had no good answers, not in the middle of winter, when leaving was impossible and continuation was the only option. To doubt during winter was to risk despair, and despair was as deadly as cold or hunger. Some cabin dwellers in their later writings describe a kind of acceptance that came after weeks of internal struggle. They stopped questioning, stopped doubting, and entered a state that was neither happy nor unhappy, but simply present. They existed in the moment because the future was too uncertain and the past too painful to dwell on. This enforced mindfulness, born not of spiritual practice, but of necessity, may have been one of the few positive adaptations to winter isolation. In this state of acceptance, small pleasures became genuinely meaningful. A slightly warmer day, a meal that tasted marginally better, a moment of connection with family. These weren't consolation prizes, but actual sources of satisfaction because expectations had been reduced to match reality. The mystery that haunts historians studying this period is how many people broke under the strain. We know that some did. There are records of settlers found in spring having succumbed not to starvation or cold, but to something less tangible. A giving up that manifested as illness or accident or simply lying down and not rising. How many others came close to that edge, but pulled back, surviving winter after winter until they finally couldn't survive another? How many survived the winter physically, but carried psychological scars that never fully healed? That shaped the rest of their lives in ways they couldn't articulate. The frontier left few records of mental health, no diagnoses of what we might now call depression or anxiety or trauma. People spoke of being poorly or melancholy, or simply said nothing at all because there was shame in admitting weakness, especially the weakness of mind rather than body. The culture of frontier life demanded stoicism, the ability to endure without complaint, and those who couldn't meet that standard often disappeared from the record entirely. To acknowledge suffering was to admit failure, and failure on the frontier could mean death, not just for oneself, but for one's entire family, who depended on collective strength to survive. We're left with gaps in the historical narrative. Families who appeared in one census and vanished by the next. Cabins found abandoned with no explanation. Stories that ended without resolution. Some of these disappearances have practical explanations. People moved on, went back east, died of disease or accident. But some percentage, unknowable now, must represent those who simply couldn't sustain the life anymore, who were worn down by the cumulative weight of too many winters, too many days of waiting. The frontier consumed people, sometimes quickly through accident or illness, sometimes slowly through attrition and despair. And the historical record preserves only the survivors' stories, not the narratives of those who broke. The question that emerges from all this evidence, fragmentary as it is, concerns the nature of adaptation. Did people become truly acclimated to this life? Or did they simply become numb to its hardships? Is there a difference between acceptance and resignation, between choosing to embrace difficulty and merely surrendering to it? The journals and letters that survive suggest a range of responses. Some settlers seem to genuinely embrace the simplicity of frontier life, finding meaning in its challenges, discovering in themselves capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. Others counted every day until they could leave, maintaining themselves through sheer willpower and the promise of eventual escape. Most probably fell somewhere between these extremes, neither embracing nor rejecting their circumstances, but simply living within them as best they could, finding neither profound meaning nor complete misery, but rather a kind of baseline existence that was neither fulfilling nor unbearable. What united them all was the experience of waiting for winter to end, for spring to come, for conditions to improve enough that normal life could resume. And perhaps this is the culture that winter created on the frontier. Not a culture of action or achievement, but of patience elevated to a survival skill. These people learned to wait the way others learned to hunt or farm or build, developing it as a practiced capability rather than a passive state. They developed strategies for managing time that moved too slowly, for maintaining hope when circumstances offered little justification for it, for continuing to function when function required nothing more than sitting by a fire and watching snowfall. This waiting was active in its own way, not passive resignation, but conscious endurance. It required mental discipline to face each morning knowing the day would bring nothing new, emotional regulation to prevent despair from taking root, and social skills to maintain family bonds under stress that would test any relationship. The ability to sit still without growing restless, to occupy oneself mentally without external stimulation, to maintain emotional equilibrium in the face of unchanging circumstances. These were skills as vital as knowing how to build a fire or preserve food. And they were skills learned through experience, not taught through instruction, absorbed through the body and mind during those long silent hours by the fire. The archaeological sites don't show us these internal struggles. They show us cabin foundations and broken pottery and the remains of hearths, the physical evidence of human habitation, but not the human experience itself. But if we look carefully, if we think about what daily life in these spaces actually entailed, we can begin to understand that the artifacts of frontier winter are not just physical objects, but patterns of time itself. Days stretched thin, hours accumulated like snowdrifts, seasons that seem to have no end. The broken pottery speaks of meals eaten in darkness, the hearthstones of fires tended through long nights, the cabin foundations of spaces that held families together, even as isolation threatened to pull them apart. The greatest mystery, perhaps, is not how people survived frontier winters, but how they maintained their humanity during them. How did they hold on to kindness when stress and deprivation made everyone irritable and short-tempered? How did they maintain relationships when proximity without privacy tested every bond? When family members saw each other at their worst day after day with no respite? How did they remember that there was a world beyond the cabin, a life beyond winter, a future that might be different from the present? These were the true tests of frontier winter. Not physical survival, but the preservation of what made life worth surviving. A person could endure hunger and cold and still remain themselves. But could they endure months of enforced intimacy with family members while maintaining love and respect? Could they face their own thoughts day after day and emerge still sane? We don't know the answers to these questions in any definitive sense. We can only infer from the fact that many did maintain these things, did survive with their families intact, did emerge from winter, ready to plant and build and continue. They must have found ways to be gentle with each other, to forgive small irritations, to share the burden of waiting. They must have developed unspoken agreements about space and silence, learning when someone needed to be left alone, even in a single room with no privacy, recognizing signs of strain before they became breaking points. They must have told each other stories about spring, reminded each other why they'd come to this place, found small reasons to laugh, even when laughter seemed inappropriate. The laughter that emerged in winter cabins was often dark humor, jokes about their circumstances that acknowledged hardship without succumbing to it. This laughter served as pressure relief, a way to express frustration and fear without letting those emotions dominate. Or perhaps they didn't do any of these things consciously. Perhaps they simply endured day after day, because humans are remarkably resilient when given no other choice, finding ways to cope that they couldn't have explained even to themselves. Survival instinct is powerful, and it manifests in unexpected ways, in the ability to find routine comforting rather than oppressive, in the capacity to lower expectations until they can be met, in the stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up seems reasonable. The human mind adapts to circumstances, however extreme, and finds ways to make the unbearable bearable through small adjustments in perspective and expectation. The culture of waiting that developed on the frontier winter was not written down in any guidebook, not taught in any formal way. It was learned by living it, absorbed through the body and the mind as surely as the cold was absorbed into bones. And it shaped the people who experienced it in ways they probably couldn't have articulated, even if asked directly. They became patient in ways that modern life doesn't require or reward. Developing the ability to sit with discomfort without needing immediate resolution, they developed a relationship with time that was fundamentally different from the clock-driven experience of urban life. One that measured duration not in hours and minutes, but in the rhythm of natural processes, the burning of logs, the cycles of hunger and satiation, the slow accumulation of fatigue followed by sleep. They learned to find meaning in small things, a slightly warmer day, a meal that tasted better than usual, a moment of connection with family, because large things, momentous events, achievements, and progress were not available. This was the hidden curriculum of frontier winter. Not the skills of survival, like building fires or rationing food, but the internal adaptations required to live with stillness without being consumed by it. These adaptations included learning to separate physical discomfort from emotional suffering, recognizing that one could be cold and hungry without necessarily being miserable. That circumstances didn't have to dictate emotional state, even though they certainly influenced it. And when spring finally came, when the waiting ended and action became possible again, these people carried their winter knowledge with them. They were changed by what they'd endured, though they might not have recognized the change themselves. because it happened so gradually day by winter day. They'd learned something about themselves, about their capacity for endurance, about what actually mattered and what didn't, about the difference between comfort and necessity. They discovered that they could survive conditions they'd once thought unsurvivable, that the human spirit was more resilient and adaptable than they'd imagined, and that sometimes survival itself was achievement enough without needing to be dressed up as anything more. Whether this learning was worth the cost is not for us to judge from our comfortable distance. They made their choices, lived their lives, survived their winters, and the equation of suffering versus growth is impossible to calculate from the outside. They paid a price for their survival in worn bodies, in lost years and psychological scars that might have healed but never quite disappeared. But they also gained something, some knowledge of themselves and their capacities that came at no other price. And somewhere in the space between survival and suffering, they created a culture, quiet, undramatic, barely visible to history, that deserves to be remembered. Not celebrated necessarily, not romanticized as noble or character building, but remembered as a testament to human adaptability and the strange things we can learn to accept when acceptance becomes the only path forward. The snow fell outside the cabin, accumulating in drifts that eventually covered the windows completely, turning the interior into a small cave of firelight. The fire burned in its stone hearth, tended carefully through day and night, because letting it die meant hours of dangerous cold before it could be relit. The days passed in their monotonous succession, each one much like the last, and people waited through them with whatever patience they could muster. That was the culture, patient, persistent, present in the moment, because there was nowhere else to be. And it worked most of the time, which is perhaps all we can ask of any culture designed not for flourishing, but for mere continuation. It kept people alive and sane enough to continue functioning, to maintain the basic routines of survival, even when those routines seemed pointless. It got them through to spring year after year, winter after winter. Though the getting through was neither easy nor painless, but rather a slow, grinding endurance that left its mark on everyone who experienced it. And if it left scars along the way, in bodies weakened by malnutrition and cold, in minds marked by months of isolation and monotony, in families strained by proximity and shared hardship, well, survival often does. The scars were part of the price, accepted as such, rarely discussed, because frontier culture didn't dwell on wounds that couldn't be healed. What mattered was that when spring finally broke through, when the snow began to melt and the ice to thaw, people emerged from their winter cabins, ready to begin again. They emerged changed, certainly marked by what they'd endured, but they emerged functional, capable of taking up the work of spring with whatever strength they had left. And perhaps that is the final statement we can make about the culture of frontier winter. That it was sufficient. Not ideal, not comfortable, not something anyone would have chosen if better options existed, but sufficient to accomplish its purpose. It preserved human life through conditions hostile to it. It maintained social bonds through circumstances that strained them nearly to breaking. It allowed people to endure months of hardship and emerge still human, still capable of hope, still willing to face another winter if necessary. The culture asked much of those who lived within it: patience without limit, endurance without complaint, acceptance of circumstances that ranged from uncomfortable to nearly unbearable. And most of the time, most of the people, most of the winters, it received what it asked for because the alternative was unthinkable. So they sat by their fires, these frontier settlers, and waited through the long winter. They told their stories and mended their clothes and rationed their food and taught their children to be still. They marked time or stopped marking it, maintained religious observance or let it lapse, held on to hope or settled for mere continuation, and spring came eventually, as it always did, though never as soon as hoped. The snow melted, the ice broke, the door could be opened without a wall of white blocking the way, and life resumed its cycles of planting and growing and harvesting, preparing once again for the winter that would inevitably return. This was the rhythm that governed frontier life, the cycle of seasons made more extreme and demanding than those who came from gentler climates had ever imagined. And the culture that developed to meet this rhythm was itself extreme, demanding, and focused with single-minded intensity on the goal of survival. Nothing was wasted. Not food, not fuel, not time, not words. Everything served the purpose of getting through, of making it to spring, of surviving another winter. And in that economy of survival, stripped of everything except necessity, something essential about human nature revealed itself. We are adaptable beyond our own imagining. We can accept conditions we would have thought unacceptable. We can endure what we would have thought unendurable. We can wait and wait and wait through winters that seem endless and emerge on the other side, still ourselves, still human, still capable of going on. That is what the culture of frontier winter teaches us, if we're willing to listen to the whispers that emerge from cabin ruins and fragmentary airy records. Not that suffering is noble, or that hardship builds character, or any of the comfortable myths we tell ourselves about difficulty, but simply that humans survive, that we find ways to cope with circumstances, however extreme, and that culture emerges from necessity to shape that coping into patterns that can be shared, taught, and passed on. The frontier winter culture was born of desperate need, shaped by harsh reality, and maintained by people who had no choice but to maintain it. And when we excavate their cabin sites today, when we handle the simple objects they left behind, when we read their sparse writings about those long winters, we're touching something essential about the human experience, the capacity for endurance, the stubborn refusal to surrender, the quiet heroism of simply continuing when continuation is all that's possible. The snow has long since melted from those frontier cabins. The fires have gone cold. The people who sat beside them waiting for spring are dust now. Their stories mostly lost. Their names forgotten except in census, records, and land deeds. But the culture they created through their waiting, the patterns of thought and behavior that allowed them to survive, these remain accessible to us if we're willing to look carefully at the evidence and think deeply about what it means. They remain as testimony to human resilience and human limitation, both to our capacity for adaptation and the costs that adaptation sometimes demands. And perhaps in our own age of comfort and convenience, when waiting has become almost obsolete and patience is rarely required, there is something valuable in remembering that our ancestors knew how to wait, knew how to endure, knew how to find meaning in stillness because they had no other choice. We have lost that knowledge mostly, and we're probably better off for the loss because it came at a terrible price. But the knowledge itself, the culture of waiting that once sustained human life through impossible winters, deserves to be remembered as part of our shared human heritage. Not as something to be emulated, but as something to be understood, respected, and preserved in the historical record as evidence of what we once were and what we might still become, if circumstances ever require it again. Let us shift our attention now from the frontier cabin to other spaces, other lives, where winter arrived in the same months, brought the same cold, yet was experienced in profoundly different ways. The contrast is important, not to judge or condemn, but to understand that winter, that most democratic of seasons, still recognize the distinctions of wealth and class. While settlers huddled in single-room cabins, counting logs and rationing cornmeal, others passed the same winter months in circumstances that offered not just survival, but genuine comfort. This is not a story of villains and victims, but rather a quiet observation about how power manifests itself, often most clearly in who gets to be warm and who must fight for warmth. Consider Philadelphia in the winter of 1780, the same general period when settlers were enduring the isolation we've already explored. Philadelphia was among the largest cities in the American colonies, a place of brick buildings and cobblestone streets where thousands of people lived in close proximity. Winter came to Philadelphia as it came to the frontier, but it arrived into a completely different infrastructure of comfort. The wealthy merchant families lived in houses that would have seemed palatial to frontier settlers, 3 or even 4 stories tall, with multiple rooms on each floor, windows that actually let in light, doors that fit their frames precisely. These houses had fireplaces in nearly every room: the parlor, the dining room, the bedrooms upstairs, sometimes even in hallways. Keeping all these fires burning required enormous amounts of wood or coal, but the wealthy could afford it. They didn't cut their own wood or haul it themselves. They employed servants for such tasks, or they purchased fuel delivered by cart. The difference this made is difficult to overstate. A home with multiple fires burning is not just warmer in degree, but different in kind from a single-room cabin heated by one half. The cold never fully penetrated these spaces. There might be drafts near windows, coolness in the corners, but the overall environment remained habitable, even comfortable. A person could move from room to room and remain warm, could sleep without piling every available blanket on their bed, could wake in the morning without seeing their breath. These houses were well insulated by the standards of the time. Thick walls, heavy curtains, carpets on the floors that trapped heat. Some wealthy homes even had internal hallways that separated living spaces from exterior walls, creating buffer zones that further insulated against the cold. The windows were real glass, often multiple panes that could be shuttered from inside for additional protection against winter winds. During daylight hours, these windows let in enough light that rooms remained bright and livable. Evening brought darkness, yes, but wealthy households had candles in abundance. Beeswax candles that burned clean and bright, not the tallow candles that sputtered and smoked. Oil lamps provided additional illumination, and a room could be made nearly as bright as day if desired. This meant that winter evenings were not a retreat into darkness and idleness, but a continuation of daily life under different lighting conditions. The wealthy read by candlelight, wrote letters, did needlework, played cards or musical instruments, engaged in conversation. The stimulation and occupation that frontier settlers lacked, forced into inactivity by cold and darkness, was available to those who could afford to purchase it in the form of fuel and light. Food in wealthy households during winter bore no resemblance to the monotonous diet of frontier cabins. Urban wealth meant access to markets, to trade networks, to preservation methods beyond simple drying and salting. Wealthy families stored root vegetables in proper cellars, kept barrels of flour and sugar, maintained supplies of spices and preserved fruits. Their winter meals might include roasted meats, pies made with dried fruits and sweetened with sugar, breads made with butter, vegetables prepared with cream and herbs. They drank imported tea and coffee, wine and spirits that added both warmth and pleasure to evening gatherings. Meals were events carefully prepared and served, maintaining variety and interest throughout the winter months. The psychological impact of this cannot be overlooked. Eating well, experiencing different flavors, having something to look forward to at mealtimes, sustained morale in ways that survival rations never could. A merchant family in winter Philadelphia might have been inconvenienced by the season, might have complained about the cold or the difficulty of travel, but they were never in danger of starving, never counting days until supplies ran out. Their relationship with winter was one of minor discomfort, not existential threat. Social life continued through the winter in these urban households, constrained somewhat by weather, but not eliminated. Wealthy families visited each other, attended dinners and gatherings, maintained connections that provided both stimulation and emotional support. These social events were possible because people lived close together, because streets were maintained enough for short journeys, because households had the resources to host guests. A dinner party in winter required heating additional rooms, lighting extra candles, preparing substantial food. All expenses that frontier families could never have contemplated. But for the urban wealthy, such gatherings were part of maintaining their social position, their network of relationships and obligations. Winter might reduce the frequency of such events, but it didn't eliminate them entirely. The contrast with frontier isolation is stark. While settlers went months without seeing anyone beyond their immediate family, urban elites were never more than a short carriage ride from company, conversation, and connection. Even when they chose to stay home, they were choosing solitude rather than having it imposed by circumstance. The wealthy also had access to institutions that provided warmth and community. Churches in cities had substantial buildings with multiple fireplaces or stoves heated for services throughout the winter. Attending church was not just a religious obligation, but a social event, a chance to see neighbors, to occupy a warm space for a few hours, to participate in communal ritual. For those with political or business connections, there were also assembly rooms, meeting halls, coffee houses, semi-public spaces that were heated and occupied throughout the winter. These spaces offered alternatives to home, places to go when cabin fever struck, opportunities for stimulation and engagement. Frontier settlers had none of this. Their world contracted to the walls of their cabin, and there it stayed until spring. Government officials, judges, merchants, professionals, the educated and wealthy classes often had work that continued through winter. But it was work performed in heated offices, courtrooms, or counting houses. A lawyer might complain about the cold walk to the courthouse, but once inside, he worked in a room warmed by a fire, surrounded by books and papers and other people. His winter was busy, filled with the same tasks and responsibilities that occupied him in warmer months. The seasonal difference was one of comfort, not of fundamental change in life's rhythm. He still had purpose, still had productivity, still had the satisfaction of accomplishment. Contrast this with the frontier settler, whose entire existence became defined by waiting, by the suspension of normal purpose and activity. The psychological toll of idleness weighed heavily on those who had no choice but to be idle. It barely touched those who remained occupied with meaningful work. Education continued for wealthy children through the winter. Private tutors came to homes, or children attended schools that were heated and operational. These children learned Latin and mathematics, read literature, practiced penmanship. Their intellectual development continued uninterrupted by season. Frontier children, meanwhile, had their education suspended or reduced to whatever parents could provide by firelight. The accumulation of knowledge, the building of skills that would determine future opportunities, these proceeded at different rates depending on whether winter meant a minor inconvenience or a complete shutdown of normal life. The divide created by winter was not absolute. There were gradations between the extremes of frontier cabin and urban mansion. Small-town merchants might have sturdy homes with 2 fireplaces, enough fuel for the winter, and adequate food, experiencing neither extreme hardship nor complete comfort. Rural farmers living on established homesteads were better positioned than frontier settlers, with larger stores of food, better built homes, and closer neighbors. But the general pattern held: the more wealth and infrastructure a person had access to, the less winter altered the basic conditions of their existence. Warmth in this sense became a measure of power. The ability to maintain a comfortable temperature regardless of external conditions, to keep lights burning after dark, to eat well and sleep soundly. These were not luxuries in the abstract sense, but concrete manifestations of social and economic position. Winter revealed this truth in ways that other seasons obscured. In summer, everyone could be warm. The sun was democratic in its heat. In winter, warmth became something that could be purchased, accumulated, protected, and those without the resources to do so suffered in direct proportion to their poverty. There's a passage in a letter from a Philadelphia merchant's wife, written in January 1781, that captures this disconnect perfectly. She writes to a friend about the inconveniences of winter, how her servants complain about fetching coal, how the cold mornings make her reluctant to leave her bed, how she's put off social visits because the carriage ride seems too unpleasant. She mentions almost as an afterthought having heard that settlers in the Western Territories are suffering from the harsh winter, and she expresses sympathy for their hardship. But the tone is distant, abstract. She cannot really imagine what that hardship entails because her own experience of winter is so fundamentally different. To her, winter is an inconvenience. To them, it's a matter of survival. The gap between these experiences is so vast that they might as well be discussing different phenomena entirely. The institutions of power, government, church, commerce, all continued functioning through winter in ways that reinforced existing hierarchies. Courts held sessions, though perhaps less frequently than in summer. Legislative bodies met and conducted business. Military operations might pause, but military planning and command continued. The machinery of colonial society kept running, heated by fireplaces and maintained by those who had the resources to insulate themselves from winter's worst effects. Meanwhile, on the frontier, governance was distant to the point of irrelevance. Church meant whatever private devotions a family could maintain, and commerce had ceased entirely. The frontier settlers' relationship to these institutions became even more tenuous in winter. They were governed by laws made in warm buildings by men who'd never experienced the cold they endured, served by a church whose representatives couldn't reach them through the snow, subject to an economic system that had temporarily forgotten their existence. This seasonal disconnect had consequences that extended beyond winter itself. When spring came and settlers could finally travel, could finally engage with markets and institutions again, they returned as supplicants in debt from winter expenses, desperate to sell whatever they'd produced, powerless to negotiate favorable terms. The urban merchants and officials had spent winter maintaining their positions and connections. The settlers had spent winter merely surviving. The gap between them had widened, and it would widen further with each passing winter until some settlers gave up entirely and returned east, or died, or adapted to permanent marginalization. Winter, in this sense, was not a great equalizer, but a great divider. It sorted people according to their resources and reinforced the advantages of those who already had them. Yet we must be careful not to romanticize frontier hardship or to vilify urban comfort. The merchant in his warm house was not responsible for the settler's cold cabin, at least not in any simple direct way. The systems that created such disparity were larger than individual choices built into the structure of colonial society and economy. The settler had presumably chosen to go to the frontier, understanding at some level the risks involved. The merchant had chosen urban life, leveraging his education and capital to build a comfortable existence. Both were making rational decisions within the options available to them. The tragedy, if tragedy is the right word, was not in individual choices, but in the fact that winter revealed these choices to have vastly unequal consequences. A mistake in judgment, a run of bad luck, an unexpected hardship. These might be recoverable setbacks for the urban wealthy, but could be fatal for the frontier poor. Winter compressed the margin for error until it nearly disappeared for those with the fewest resources. There were occasionally people who bridged these worlds. Missionaries who chose to live among frontier settlements. Government surveyors who traveled between civilization and wilderness. Traders who brought goods to remote areas. These intermediaries experienced both modes of winter, and their accounts provide interesting perspectives. A missionary might spend weeks in a frontier cabin, sharing the hardship of the families he served, then return to established town or city where comfort was available. The contrast was jarring, and some wrote about it. The strangeness of moving from deprivation to plenty within a few days. Travel. The guilt of returning to warmth while knowing others remained in the cold. But most returned to comfort without comment, accepting the disparity as natural, perhaps even as evidence of divine favor or personal virtue. The ideology of the time supported such interpretations. Prosperity was often seen as a sign of God's blessing, hardship as a test of faith, or a consequence of poor planning. The wealthy could look at their warm homes and abundant food and see confirmation of their righteousness. The poor could look at their cold cabins and scarce supplies and wonder what they'd done wrong. Few questioned whether the system itself might be structured to produce these outcomes, regardless of individual merit or morality. Winter, then, was not just a season, but a social sorting mechanism. A test that some took in warm rooms with full bellies, while others took in cold cabins with hunger gnawing at their resolve. The results of this test determined futures, shaped opportunities, created trajectories that would echo through generations. A child who spent winters in a heated home, receiving education and proper nutrition, would enter adulthood with advantages that no amount of frontier hardiness could overcome. A child who spent winters in survival mode, whose education was interrupted or non-existent, whose body was weakened by cold and inadequate food, started life's race from behind and often never caught up. This was how winter reinforced class divisions, not through any single dramatic event, but through the slow accumulation of small advantages and disadvantages year after year, winter after winter. By the time spring arrived, the wealthy had maintained their position or even improved it. The poor had fallen further behind, or at best broken even. And this pattern repeated itself annually, creating a cycle that was extraordinarily difficult to break. Some did break it, of course, exceptional individuals who managed through luck or determination or unusual circumstances to rise above their origins. But for everyone who rose, many more remained where they started or fell further. Winter was one of the mechanisms that made this so, functioning as a kind of stress test that the well-resourced passed easily, while the under-resourced struggled desperately just to survive. As we consider this divide, we might reflect on what it means that warmth, such a basic human need, could be so unevenly distributed. The technology to create warmth existed. Every hearth and fireplace was proof of that. What varied was access to the fuel that made warmth possible and to the structures that contained it efficiently. These were not technological problems, but social and economic ones. Questions of who owned the forests, where fuel could be cut, who had the money to purchase fuel if they couldn't cut it themselves, who had the time and resources to build well-insulated homes. Winter exposed these inequalities with brutal clarity, turning abstract economic differences into concrete experiences of comfort versus suffering. And perhaps that's the real story of winter on the frontier versus winter in the cities. Not that one was hard and the other easy in any absolute sense, but that they represented different relationships to the same season. Relationships determined largely by factors beyond individual control. The settlers waited in their cold cabins because they had to. The wealthy waited in their warm homes because they could. Both were waiting for spring. But the quality of that waiting, the psychological and physical toll it took, differed so dramatically that they might as well have been enduring different seasons entirely. One winter was dangerous, the other merely inconvenient. One winter threatened survival, the other threatened only comfort. One winter left scars that might never fully heal. The other left nothing more than memories of mild discomfort. And when spring came at last, when the snow melted and travel became possible again, both groups emerged from winter and resumed their lives. But they did not emerge equal. They emerged with the same relative positions they had held before, or with those positions further entrenched. Winter had not leveled the playing field. It had tilted it further in favor of those who'd already had advantages. The frontier settler returned to his land and tried to build on what little he'd preserved through the cold months. The urban merchant opened his account books and calculated profits from trade that had continued in reduced form even through winter. Both moved forward into spring, but they moved forward on different trajectories shaped by the winters they'd endured. And so the cycle continued year after year. Winter arriving, winter dividing, winter rewarding those who needed no rewards and punishing those who could least afford punishment. The snow fell equally on mansion and cabin alike, but equality ended there. The rest was a matter of resources, of power, of the ancient human pattern of advantage accumulating to those who already had it. Winter didn't create this pattern, but it revealed it, made it visible in the most concrete terms imaginable. The warmth of the fire, the abundance of food, the comfort of sleep. These simple things, these basic requirements of human life, were available in vastly different measures, depending on where you stood in the social order. And if that seems unfair, well, winter never promised to be fair. It simply was indifferent to human arrangements, falling on everyone and treating them according to their means. The injustice, such as it was, lay not in winter, itself, but in the systems that determined who would face it with resources, and who would face it with nothing more than endurance and hope. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, though perhaps arrival is the wrong word. We've been sitting still all along, haven't we? Waiting through these long winter hours together. We've traveled through time, but not through space. Moved through stories while remaining comfortably where we are. That's fitting somehow for a narrative about waiting, about the experience of remaining in one place while the world slowly turns. We began in a frontier cabin, feeling the cold seep through the walls, watching frost patterns form on the interior surfaces, counting logs in a dwindling wood pile. We lived through the daily repetition, the same small tasks performed over and over, the same meals eaten day after day, the same darkness falling early and lifting late. We felt time become strange and elastic, days losing their individual character, weeks blurring into an undifferentiated gray expanse. We knew the fatigue that comes not from physical exertion, but from simply continuing to exist in uncomfortable circumstances with no clear end in sight. Then we followed Sarah Kemble Knight through her unexpected winter isolation, watched her journal entries grow shorter and flatter as the season wore on, saw how even an educated, capable woman from the city found herself reduced to the same basic struggle. Keeping warm, staying fed, maintaining sanity through sheer persistence. Her story reminded us that winter's grip was indifferent to background or preparation, that intelligence and resources could delay hardship, but not eliminate it entirely. She waited just as the poorest settler waited, maybe with slightly more comfort, maybe with better understanding of what she was experiencing, but still fundamentally powerless against the season's duration. We drifted then into something more abstract. The culture that emerged from all this waiting. The ways people adapted psychologically to conditions that couldn't be changed physically. We looked at cabin archaeology and saw choices made for survival rather than comfort. Low ceilings, small windows, everything designed to trap heat and minimize fuel consumption. We thought about time without clocks, about how days lost their definition, when there was nothing to distinguish one from another. We considered the food that sustained bodies but offered no pleasure, the silence that pressed in from all sides, the internal strategies people developed to cope with monotony and isolation. We ask questions that have no clean answers. How many broke under the strain? How many adapted versus how many merely endured? Whether acceptance of these conditions was strength or resignation. The mysteries remained mysterious, as they should, because the inner lives of frontier settlers left few traces in the historical record. Finally, we turned our attention to contrast, to those who experienced the same winter months, in circumstances so different they barely resembled the same season. We saw warmth purchased and maintained, saw comfort taken for granted, saw how winter could be an inconvenience rather than a threat when resources were sufficient. We noted how this divide reinforced itself year after year, how winter became not an equalizer, but a sorting mechanism that rewarded those who already had advantages and punished those who could least afford punishment. We observed all this without anger or judgment, just the quiet recognition that human societies have always distributed comfort unequally, and winter made that inequality impossible to ignore. Now, here at the end, what can we say about it all? What did we learn from sitting with these long ago winters? From inhabiting these cold spaces in our imagination? Perhaps we learned that survival is not always dramatic, that endurance often looks like simply sitting still and continuing to breathe. Perhaps we learned that time is more flexible than we usually acknowledge, that it can stretch or compress depending on circumstance and state of mind. Perhaps we learned that humans are capable of adapting to remarkably difficult conditions, not always gracefully, not always without cost, but adapting nonetheless. Or perhaps we learned nothing we didn't already know, and the value was simply in the noticing, in paying attention to experiences that history usually passes over quickly on its way to more exciting events. The people we've been thinking about, the settlers in their cabins, Sarah Kemble Knight, stranded in Datum, the families who developed cultures of waiting, they're all gone now, of course. The winters they endured ended eventually, followed by springs and summers, and then more winters. Their lives continued or didn't. Their struggles resolved or didn't. Their suffering left marks or faded without trace. Most died without fame or recognition, their names appearing only in census records or land deeds, if they appear at all. Their cabins rotted back into the earth, their possessions dispersed or destroyed, their stories untold except in the most general terms. What remains is the knowledge that they existed, that they faced winters that wouldn't end, that they waded through darkness and cold and came out the other side or didn't, and were replaced by others who tried again. There's something both sad and comforting about that, isn't there? Sad because their suffering was real and hard and often pointless. Many of them struggled for years, only to fail, to give up and return east, or to die on the land they tried to claim. But comforting because it reminds us that difficulty is not new, that humans have always faced hard seasons and found ways through them, or haven't, and been replaced by those who did. We're not unique in our struggles, whatever those struggles might be. We're part of a long continuity of people dealing with circumstances we didn't choose and can't control, doing our best with what we have, waiting for conditions to improve. The frontier winters we've explored were particularly harsh, particularly isolating, particularly long. But they were not unprecedented in human experience, and they won't be the last difficult seasons humans endure. As you lie here now, perhaps in darkness, or in the dim light of a screen, perhaps comfortable in a warm bed, or at least somewhere that isn't actively threatening your survival. You're living in a completely different world from the one we've been imagining. Your winter, if you're experiencing winter at all, is moderated by heating systems that work without constant attention, by electric lights that banish darkness at the flip of a switch, by food security that frontier settlers couldn't have imagined. You can know what time it is at any moment, can reach across distances to communicate with others, can be certain that spring will come on schedule because meteorology is a science now rather than hopeful observation. The gap between your experience and theirs is vast, not just technological, but psychological. A fundamental difference in relationship to the natural world and to time itself. And yet perhaps there are still moments when you understand something of what they felt. Perhaps you've known waiting that seemed endless, not for winter to end, but for other things, for illness to heal, for situations to resolve, for pain to diminish. Perhaps you felt time slow down in uncomfortable ways, days becoming identical and meaningless, the future uncertain, and the present unbearable, but bearable, because there's no alternative. Perhaps you've learned, as they learned, that endurance is not heroic, but simply what remains when all other options are exhausted. If so, then maybe these old stories have something to offer beyond historical curiosity. Maybe they remind us that patience is ancient, that waiting is not weakness, that continuing through difficulty is achievement enough, even when it produces nothing else. The settlers didn't need to be heroes. They just needed to wake up each morning and face another day. Sometimes that was enough, sometimes it wasn't. But they tried anyway. We can honor that trying without romanticizing it, can recognize the difficulty without claiming to fully understand it, can remember the waiting without pretending we know how it felt in any complete sense. As we finish this quiet journey through winter's longest nights, as we prepare to return to our own time and place, it seems right to acknowledge the comfort of where we are. We've been exploring discomfort, yes, but we've been doing so from positions of relative safety and ease. We can think about cold cabins while remaining warm, can consider food scarcity while having plenty, can imagine isolation while remaining connected. This distance is necessary. It allows us to consider these experiences without being traumatized by them. But it's also a kind of privilege that the people we've been thinking about didn't have. They couldn't step away from their winters into warmth and plenty. They had to live through every cold hour until the season finally released them. So perhaps we owe them something. Not pity, which would be condescending, and not admiration, which might be excessive, but simply acknowledgement. They were here. They struggled. They waited through winters that wouldn't end. And they survived or didn't. Their experience was real and hard and theirs. And it shaped the world that eventually became ours. The frontier they settled, the communities they built during the brief warm months between winters, the patterns they established through their persistence. These things rippled forward through time and contributed in small ways to the present we inhabit. We are in some distant sense the spring they were waiting for, not personally, not directly, but as inheritors of what they began. The land they struggled to claim is settled and comfortable now. The communities they founded have grown into towns and cities. The wilderness they feared has been tamed and subdivided and turned into something manageable. Winter still comes, of course, but it comes differently, announced by forecasts, managed by technology, endured with confidence that it will end on schedule. We've mastered winter in ways they could only dream of. And in doing so, we've perhaps lost some understanding of what winter actually is. A force indifferent to human wishes. A season that teaches patience because it cannot be rushed. But on nights like this, when we're still and quiet and willing to listen, maybe we can touch something of what they knew. Maybe we can feel for just a moment what it meant to wait without certainty, to continue without guarantee of success, to sit by a fire and watch darkness press against the windows and know that morning will come. But spring might not, or might come too late. It's not a comfortable feeling, but it's a real one, and there's value in sitting with it briefly before we return to our insulated lives. So, let yourself rest now. Let the stories settle into whatever part of your mind holds historical memories and human connections across time. The people we've been thinking about have been resting for a long time. Their struggles are over. Their winters ended permanently. Their waiting finally finished. They've earned their rest. And so, have you earned yours? Here, at the end of this particular journey through time. Tomorrow will be your tomorrow, not theirs. And it will come with its own challenges and comforts, its own waiting and its own resolutions. But tonight, for these last few moments, you can hold both. Your present comfort and their distant struggle, your temporary stillness and their prolonged endurance. You can let the contrast remind you of how far human societies have come in managing the basic difficulties of existence, and also how recent that progress is, how fragile it might be. Winter still waits, patient and indifferent, ready to remind us of our limitations if our systems fail. But for now, those systems hold. The warmth continues, the lights work, the food is sufficient. And spring will come when the calendar says it should. You are safe, you are comfortable, and you can drift now into sleep, knowing that tomorrow will be different from today, that time is moving forward at its normal pace, that you don't have to measure your life in dwindling wood piles or rationed meals. The winter we explored was someone else's winter, a long time ago, in circumstances you'll never have to face. Let it recede now. Let it become part of the past where it belongs. A story told and finished. Close your eyes and feel the comfort of your present moment. The warmth around you. The softness beneath you. The quiet that comes from safety rather than isolation. You've waited with them through their long season, but you don't have to stay there. You can return to your own time, your own place, your own much shorter and much more manageable winter. Sleep now, comfortable and warm, knowing that spring always comes eventually, that waiting always ends, that dawn follows even the longest night. The frontier settlers knew this too, held on to it through their darkest hours, and they were right. Spring came, as it always does. And if they could endure their waiting with so few resources and so little certainty, surely you can rest peacefully with all the comfort and security that surrounds you now. Let go of the cold and the darkness. Let go of the frontier and its struggles. Let go of everything except the gentle certainty that morning will come, and you will wake to it refreshed and ready. The winter that wouldn't end. It ended after all for them and for you. Rest well in that knowledge, and sleep deeply through this short and manageable night. The story is finished. The waiting is over. And you, unlike those frontier settlers, can wake whenever you wish to a world that's warm and bright and full of possibilities they could only imagine. That's your gift from their struggle. The comfort to rest without fear, to sleep without keeping one eye on the fire, to trust that tomorrow will be better than today. Accept it gratefully, sleep peacefully, and when you wake, carry forward some small memory of those who waited in the cold so long ago. They would want you to be warm. They would want you to be comfortable. They would want you to sleep well and wake rested to live in the world their endurance helped create. So do that now. Sleep and let the last traces of winter fade into dreams that are warmer and kinder than any winter night they ever knew. Do you?